Hi everyone, I'm Liz, and welcome back to Elizabeth Ann Can Stitch. Hi everyone, welcome back to episode 2 of the Scrappy Trip Around the World Quilt Along. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to put together one of the quilt blocks using the method linked below from Woodbury Way and Quiltville. I ran into a little issue while putting together my quilt blocks. I discovered that my jelly roll was actually 2 5/8 inches wide rather than 2 1/2 inches wide. So when I used my 1/4 inch presser foot using kind of a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, that meant that my finished squares, instead of being 2 inches finished, ended up being 2 by 2 1/8. So my blocks did not turn out perfectly square at 16 1/2 inches by 16 1/2 inches. They actually turned out 16 1/2 inches by 17 1/4, which is only really an issue because of the way that Woodbury Way suggests you put together the quilt blocks by putting them all together the same way and then rotating one of them a 1/4 turn. Well, if I rotated one of my blocks a 1/4 turn, then I would be trying to pair up a 16 1/2 inch side with a 17 1/4 inch side, and it just would never line up right. So, you'll see in this video where I do a little bit of problem solving to figure out a way to make my non-square quilt blocks work, and I think it's going to work out perfect. And yeah, so hopefully this video isn't too confusing, and if any of you run into the same issue, you can see how I solve it. If your jelly roll strips are 2 1/2 inches wide, then you will not have to do this workaround, and you can follow the Woodbury Way link exactly as called for, but my method will deviate a little bit from that in this video, as you will see. But I still hope this video is useful and helpful. I do walk you through putting together 2 of these blocks, actually, I do on camera, and that is from sewing all of your strip sets together. So remember, we started with our strip set of 8 strips, 4 light and 4 dark, and then transforming those into tubes, cutting them apart, and resewing them into these Trip Around the World blocks. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I grabbed all of the strips for my first block. So I am going to alternate light and dark. Okay, so here's how I'm going to lay out my 8 strips, alternating dark and light. And now the next step is to sew all of these strips together. And I am going to do some chain piecing. So I am going to sew each pair together, and then I'll sew all the pairs into one big block. So let me show you how I do that. Okay, I'm just taking my pair of strips and I'm going to line them up. I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam to sew these together. So now I'm going to keep these in order. This was my last one, my third one, my second one, and my first one, and let's take these to the ironing board. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and press all of my seams open on the first 4 pairs of strips. If you prefer to press to the side, definitely press to the side. There are some tips at the link I listed on Woodbury Way about like which way to press each time you sew a strip together. So if you prefer to press to the side, definitely go read those instructions. I prefer to press open, so I'm going to show you how I accomplish that with this block. so I've got them all pressed. So let me lay them back out. Make sure they're still in the right order. Okay, and so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew these two pairs to each other. So I'm going to stack those up and make sure I know which side I'm sewing on. And I'm just trying to make sure the selvages are lined up. That way I'm like cutting off as little as possible. I'm getting the most usable length, because you do need exactly 21 inches of length out of these strips to make this block work. So I'm just making sure I'm not wasting anything when I line everything up. And so then that will get sewn like that. Okay, so I'm going to sew this one, and then I'm going to sew this one. Okay, so now I have 4 strips sewn together, and I'm going to press the seam open, same as before. And I'm just being careful on this one that I don't disrupt the other 2 seams that I've already pressed. Okay, great. So then the last 2 seams that we need to sew are these and the top and bottom. So I will line these up, and I will take this to the sewing machine, and I'm just going to do a 1/4 inch on each side, and I'll show that to you. So this is the part where we're making ourselves kind of a fabric tube, and so we just want the edges nice and straight and lined up to each other. I'm going to do the right side first. Okay, one side sewn. Flip it to the other side. Make sure everything's nice and lined up. And close off this side. Okay, so now we have all 8 of our strips sewn together in this tube. So let's take it over to the cutting mat, and I'll show you how we cut this up and resew it to become our final block. Okay, so we have our 8 strips sewn together into a tube, as you can see. And if you followed my pressing open method, then you'll have most of the seams pressed open, except for the 2 on the ends. And the only reason I don't press these open right now is because it helps to have these flat for doing the next step as we cut apart this strip. So I'll go back and press these seams later. So this is what we have, and we need to cut this into 8 2.5 inch strips. So I am going to square off an end. I think I'll square from this end, and I want to try to be as accurate as possible because I really need the whole width of this fabric to get all 8 strips. So this seems to be my shortest one right here, and so I'm actually going to use my seam line to line up a mark, and then make sure, oops, that everything is lining up nicely at the top. And I'm going to trim this side. And nice. Okay, so I have a nice straight edge here. Flip this over. And so I'm just going to use my ruler here and a 2.5 inch line to cut out all these strips. And so we need 8 of these little tubes of fabric. And so I'm using the 2.5 inch line straight down, and I'm kind of eyeballing some of my other straight lines to make sure everything is nice and square. I want these seams perpendicular to the cut edge. So okay. And so here is my leftover. So I did have a good 1.5 inches or so extra, so I didn't have to be so careful, but good to know for my future blocks. And now I have my 8 strips all cut out and ready to become a trip around the world block. So let me show you the next step. I'm just going to lay these out so I keep track of where I'm at. Okay, so basically what we're going to do from here is open up these tubes. We're going to seam rip one of the seams in a certain order to undo all of our long strips before we combine them again. I think it'll make more sense as I start doing it. So let me grab my seam ripper and get started. Okay, so with this first one, I'm just going to undo this top seam and lay it out. And so for seam ripping, my tip for you is to get your seam ripper under a stitch and just release kind of, I don't know, every 1/2 inch or every like 4th or 5th stitch. You don't have to actually seam rip every single stitch to get the seam open. So I'm just gonna slide my seam ripper under every few stitches. And then I'm just gonna gently pull apart, and there we have our very first strip. And so then, you know, we'll have to go back and I'll press this open at some point, but for now I'm just gonna lay it right here. Okay, so now this is our starting point, and basically we're gonna seam rip one seam down on all of these so they stagger. And so since I did this seam here, I'm gonna do this seam on the next one. So I'm just gonna lift this up and do the same thing. Lay that down so you can see how that's going to start to stagger. And so now I'm going to do this seam. Okay, and so then for these, I think I'm going to just flip them over and then okay, perfect. So now we have all of our strips opened up and in the right order, and we're just gonna sew them together. I'm gonna sew them together the same way I did my original strips, where I'm just gonna sew them, chain piece them in pairs and then pairs, just because that will speed up my process a little bit. And then I think first thing I'm gonna open up all the seams that I didn't press earlier. But yeah, the only other thing to think about is that your blocks do need to alternate. So we're making 10 of one style of block and 10 of another. They're made the exact same way. The only thing that's different is that you want to start with 10 blocks with a light color fabric in the top left and 10 blocks with a dark color fabric in the top left. That's if you're doing the light and dark version that I'm doing. If you're doing completely scrappy, then you don't need to worry about this step. But for me, I'm going to make sure I make 10 blocks with the light fabric starting in the top left, and then 10 blocks with a dark fabric starting in the top left. And that way, that'll help them alternate when I line them all up. So that is my plan. Yeah, so let's go to the ironing board and the sewing machine and start sewing all these together. Okay, so I have my first two columns of the block, or the first two strip sets of the block, and I need to sew these together. And so what I like to do is pin in a couple of key places to make everything line up. So this is my first row to my second row. So just lay these down, line them up, and what I will do is I will make sure that the center is lined up perfectly and give that a little pin. And then I will go down and do the first two seam intersections. So I've got that one. And this one. Okay, and so that's all the pinning that I do for these strips. Since we sewed these together in long strips and cut them up very like evenly and precisely, everything should match up really well. But I just like to pin in the center and the edges to make sure everything stays in place while I sew. So let's sew this first seam together. Okay, so that's the first pair. And I'm going to repeat that exact same steps for the other 3 pairs. And then we're going to get the whole block sewn together. So now I have all 8 strips sewn into 4 pairs. And so let's take these to the ironing board and press them open, and then we'll sew the rest of the seams. Okay, so let's get these pressed open. Okay, so then let me lay them out and make sure I have them all in the right order again. Okay, perfect. So we have our 4 strips, and so I'm going to sew 2 and 2 together, and then both of these panels of 4 into one big panel of 8. The reason I like to do this in pairs and then pair up the pairs and pair up the pair rather than just sewing one column to the next is just in my experience, when I have sewn long strips together starting on one side and going all the way to the end, I feel like my piece kind of slightly skews. It doesn't remain perfectly square if I start on one end and work to the other. So I always, when I can, like to piece kind of outside in, if that makes sense. So do whatever you would like and whatever you prefer. You can definitely start on one end and just attach each row, but I prefer to do this in sections because I feel like it makes my block a little bit more square in the end. So I'm going to get these 2 pinned up and sewn, and then we'll come back and do the finishing seam to make the final block. Okay, so now we have our strips of 4 together. Let me get this pressed. Just making sure I don't disturb the other seams I've already pressed. Okay. Making sure they still match up. And so now our final seam is this one. So let me get that together and I'll show you the finished block. Okay, so here is my first completed block. So you can see the pattern that we set up with our strips. I think it looks great, but I did notice something when I laid it out, and maybe you can tell right now, but it is taller than it is wide, which means I think that my 2.5-inch jelly roll strips were a little bit wider than 2.5 inches. I should have probably done this at the start. I haven't done a jelly roll project in about 2 years, ever since I made my Halloween Irish chain quilt out of jelly rolls. And some jelly rolls are a little wider. Okay, before I go any further, let me grab this little bundle of strips here and let's kind of measure. Yeah, it is over 2.5 inches. Where? So it's like 2 5/8. And what that means now is that my strips, you can see the pinked edges here, they're running this way. So my block is now taller than it is wide. Like, let's measure these should measure 2 inches square. But instead they're 2 1/8 by 2 inches. So that is why my block, oh man, okay, good times. So if you haven't already started yours, just make sure you know how wide your strips are. If I had known that, I would have used a bigger seam allowance than 1/4 inch. I really should have checked that before I got started, but that's okay. I'm going to show you how I'm going to work around this. Basically, what that means is that I am going to make all of my blocks go this direction, meaning the pinked edges, the width of my strips go on top and bottom. So a block can go like this, or it can go like this, right? And this will always be my width. And that way, my blocks will always turn out to be the same size, so that when I sew them together, I'm able to match up all of my seams on the sides, and I'm able to match them all up on the bottom, because these will be slightly narrower. These will be the actual 2-inch width, and this will be 2 1/8. So I always want to be sewing this side to another one that's this side, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Hopefully your jelly roll strips were a little bit closer to 2.5 inches. These were solidly 2 5/8, which is just throwing me off by 1/8 of an inch, but that's okay. As long as I make all my blocks the same way and line them up the same way, then they'll be super easy to sew together. It's just that mine is not quite perfectly square. So my quilt will actually turn out to be the correct width, which is 64 inches, but mine will end up being probably 84 or 85 inches when it's all said and done, rather than just being 80 inches long, because my blocks are going to end up being about an inch longer than they are meant to be. But that's okay. Okay, so I just want to point that out in case you can kind of notice it sitting on my mat, that it's about 16.5 by 17.25. So it's not a perfect 16.5 inch square like it's supposed to be, but that's okay. This is the first time I've made this quilt, by the way. I don't even remember if I said that in the kickoff. So I'm learning along with you guys. This is a true quilt along, and I'm just showing you how I put it together. So yeah, let's do the second block. Just putting a safety pin up in this top left corner, just to remind me that this is the top left of one of my blocks, so that, you know, it's helpful for laying it out later. So first block done. Okay, so for the second block, same as before, I'm gonna lay my strips out in a pleasing pattern, alternating lights and darks. So hopefully that's all on camera, but I got my block all laid out. And so now I'm just going to sew the block together, or sew the strips together in the same fashion that I showed you before, by pairing up each set and then sewing them all together. Okay, so I have my next strip set sewn into a tube, and I'm going to cut this down into 2.5-inch strips, and then I'm going to talk about how I'm going to fix my mistake from earlier because I didn't measure my jelly roll strips. So let me cut this up real quick. Okay, let's revisit this block. Originally I'd put the safety pin on this corner to make these blocks go longer than they are wide. I thought about that and I decided I'd actually prefer extra width rather than length. So I'm gonna run my blocks this way so that they are wider with the pinked edges on the sides, rather than being taller. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to clarify. Second thing is, this is where my tutorial is going to differ from the Woodbury Way method that I have linked to below. She tells you to make blocks the exact same way with 10 that start with a solid color, or I mean a dark color, and 10 that start with a light color. And then the ones with the light color, you would rotate a quarter turn. Well, as I explained before, I cannot rotate these a quarter turn. I can only rotate them half turn. They can either go, you know, this way or the other way. They can't do quarter turns because then my seams will not line up. So I'm gonna have to assemble my blocks in a slightly different fashion. And I'm gonna show you that. Okay, and so this is how I assembled the first block this long ways. And so even though I'm going to lay them sideways, I'm gonna assemble the blocks in the same way so I end up with the right layout. I hope this makes sense. Okay, so I do want to make my block the same way with light in the top left corner, but instead of having my rows come down this way, I want the opposite. I want the patterns to flow this way. So I think how I'm going to do that is by starting on the right side and opening up my blocks from here, and I'm gonna make this green one be, okay, yeah, let me try this out and see if it works. Doing a little bit of improvising here since I didn't measure my blocks, or my strips, I mean. It's very frustrating. I really should have done that. I guess, you know, tip for all of you, check your strips before you get started and make adjustments. Yeah, I think this is gonna work. So I'm just gonna make this block essentially kind of backwards because I want an opposite angle with the diagonal lines because, you know, I'll flash the picture of the finished quilt again and you can kind of see like what I'm going for with the kind of radiating from the center, those diagonals. And so I'm just trying to make sure I can do that with the blocks I have. So yeah, you can already start to see it'll come down like this. And so then, well, I'll show you in a minute. You'll see. Okay, so I got this block laid out so that the diagonal stripes go that way. And so then you'll see when they match up together, how you'll get the kind of radiating diagonals. Hopefully you can see that okay. Perfect. So I'm gonna get this block sewn together and then come back and wrap this up. Okay, so now I have my second block done. And so you can tell, let's see, I think I made it this way. But so you can see how on this one, the angles go top left to bottom right, and this one, they go top right to bottom left. And I'm actually gonna run them sideways, and so they'll end up in the quilt looking something like this. Oh my gosh, this is gonna be so cute. I'm really excited. And I'm also really happy that I figured out a plan to make my blocks work, because if I had just followed the Woodbury Way method completely after realizing my strips were too wide, none of my blocks would have ended up sewing together accurately, because actually I'll show you right here. So imagine if I tried to sew these two together. I've got an extra inch up here, right? Like none of my seams would line up right. So I deviated a little bit from the Woodbury Way method so that I could make my fabrics work. If you have perfect 2.5-inch strips, follow the method that I linked. But if your jelly roll strips are a little bit wider, then definitely I think follow my method. That way, you know, you don't have to start trimming down your jelly roll strips, which is so silly because the whole reason I'm using jelly roll strips is to save time because they're already cut. But they are a generous 2.5 because they are exactly 2 5/8. So that just made my block unsquare, but that is okay. I think once all the blocks are made and sewn together, it's going to look beautiful. I just have to be mindful of how I make my blocks so that everything lines up. So super happy with that. Now I need to make the rest of my blocks. 2 down, 18 more to go. Okay, so that was how I put together my trip around the world blocks. I have got 4 of mine done so far, so that means I have 16 more to make before I can come back and give you the next video. So hopefully I'll get that done over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Oh, I did time myself, I wanted to mention. So I've made 4 of these so far, and I timed myself start to finish on one where I wasn't filming, so I didn't have any anything that was taking up any of my time. So basically it took me 40 minutes from start to finish to make one of these blocks. I definitely think there are probably, maybe there's like some efficiencies to be had making like more than one block at a time, but I prefer to just do one block at a time so I like keep on track and know exactly what I'm doing and I don't mess up any of my strips. So it took me about 40 minutes to make one of these. So I think that gives me about 10 more hours of sewing to make the other 16. So yeah, so in the next video, I will share with you all how I'm going to put the full quilt top together, how to sew all the blocks together, and it'll also be, you know, I'll show you how I put specifically my blocks together since I have the little bit of the sizing issue, but it won't be an issue the way I'm going to lay them out. So hopefully I'll be back in a few weeks to finish up the quilt top and then it'll be time to get it quilted. So yay! Thank you so much for joining me and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!